Elena stood alone, staring at the latest painting she had finished, her hands still smudged with paint. The scene in front of her was unsettling. A violent storm tearing through the sea, an old boat tossed by towering waves, and a lighthouse barely visible in the distance. The door creaked open, and Elena turned to see a man step inside. He was tall, with weathered skin and a stiff, cautious gait. His name was Tom Hill, a retired fisherman known to everyone in town. He was a man of few words, but there was something about his silence that carried weight. "Elena," Tom greeted her with a nod, his eyes immediately drawn to the stormy painting on the wall. "Tom," she replied, her voice soft, unsure. Tom stepped closer, his gaze fixated on the painting. He frowned. "I've seen that storm," he muttered, as if speaking to himself. 50 years ago it hit the town. We lost a lot of good people that night." Elena's heart quickened. 50 years ago? How can you be sure? Tom's eyes darkened, filled with memories he didn't seem ready to share. "You painted it like you were there." Elena bit her lip, glancing at the storm she had painted. She wasn't from this town. She had never lived through that storm, so how had she captured it so vividly? "It just came to me," she said, more to herself than to Tom. Tom studied her for a long moment, then spoke in his low, gravelly voice. "This town has secrets, Elena. Maybe you've stirred some of them up." Before she could respond, the door opened again, and Sarah Johnson stepped in. She looked weary, her face pale with worry. Her son, Luke, had been sick for months, and the doctors were still at a loss. "Afternoon," Sarah greeted them, though her eyes were distant, her mind clearly on something else. Eleanor offered a sympathetic smile. "Feel free to look around," she said, hoping to provide some distraction. Sarah's gaze landed on one particular painting, a portrait of a young boy by the sea, his face pale and drawn. She froze. "That boy," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He looks just like Luke." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She had never met Luke. "I didn't know," Eleanor stammered, confused and slightly unnerved. "I didn't mean to—" Sarah shook her head, eyes wide. "How could you have known? It's uncanny." Tom, standing quietly by, stepped forward. "You're seeing it too, huh? There's something about her paintings. They don't just show what's on the surface." The tension in the room was thick, like the air before a storm. Elena felt the weight of their stares, but had no answers to give. The truth was, she didn't know how her brush could capture things she shouldn't understand, things that were deeply personal to the people in this town. Outside, the sky darkened. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The wind had picked up by the time Sarah left the gallery, her expression still troubled. Elena stood in front of the painting of the boy, her mind racing. The resemblance to Luke had been undeniable. But how could she have painted someone she had never seen? As the wind rattled the windows, Elena turned to Tom, who remained by the door, his eyes still fixed on the stormy painting. "Tom," she began, her voice hesitant, "do you think there's something more to this?" Tom didn't answer right away. He seemed deep in thought, his weathered face betraying years of stories untold. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "This town has a past, Elena. Things people don't like to talk about. Things we buried a long time ago, but maybe you're digging them up." Elena felt a shiver creep down her spine. "What do you mean? I'm just an artist. I'm not trying to dig up anything." Tom glanced at her, his eyes sharp and knowing. "Maybe it's not about what you're trying to do. Maybe it's about what the town is trying to tell you." A cold silence filled the room. Elena didn't know how to respond. She had come to this small seaside town to escape her own past, to find peace. But now, it felt like she had walked straight into the heart of a mystery she didn't understand. Tom sighed, stepping closer to the door. "You should talk to Sarah. Her boy. There's more to his sickness than doctors can explain, and I think, deep down, she knows it. Eleanor nodded, though she didn't know what she could say to Sarah. How could she explain that her painting seemed to be connected to this place in ways she couldn't comprehend? Before she could dwell on it further, Tom opened the door to leave. The gust of wind that blew in sent a chill through the gallery. He turned to her one last time, his face grim. "You've got to be careful, Elena. Some things are best left buried." With that, he was gone, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts. She glanced back at the painting of the boy. His eyes seemed darker now, filled with a sorrow that hadn't been there before. The sea behind him looked angrier, more violent, as if it were alive. Elena rubbed her arms, trying to shake off the cold creeping into her bones. She moved to the window and looked out at the horizon. The storm clouds were growing thicker, darker, as if something was brewing, something much bigger than just the weather. The next morning, Elena found herself standing at the door of Sarah's small home. She hadn't planned on coming, but Tom's words from the night before echoed in her mind. There was more to Luke's sickness, and somehow Elena felt that her paintings held a clue. She knocked lightly, and moments later Sarah answered the door. Her face was pale, dark circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept in days. "Elena," Sarah said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to check on Luke," Eleanor replied, feeling a little awkward. I've been thinking about that painting. There's something strange happening, and I think we need to talk." Sarah's eyes flickered with a mixture of relief and fear. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Inside, the house was dimly lit, the sound of the wind outside adding to the unease that filled the room. Luke was lying on the couch, his face pale and drawn, just like the boy in the painting. His eyes were half closed, and he murmured softly under his breath words that made no sense. "He's been like this for days," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "He talks in his sleep, says things about the sea, about people he's never met." Eleanor felt a chill run through her. "What kind of things?" Sarah sat down beside her son, running a hand through his hair. "He talks about the storm, Eleanor. The storm from years ago, the one Tom mentioned. He says it's coming back." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. How could a child like Luke, who had never lived through that storm, know about it? "And what else?" "He says—" Sarah hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He says people are coming for him, people from the sea." Eleanor's mind raced. The storm, the sea, her paintings, everything seemed connected, but she didn't know how or why. "Sarah, I think something from the past is trying to come back. I don't know what it is, but we can't ignore it." Sarah looked up at her, her eyes filled with tears. "But what do we do? How do we stop it?" Eleanor didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure what to believe anymore. But one thing was clear: the storm was coming, and it wasn't just a storm of wind and rain. "We need to talk to Tom again," Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear building inside her. "He knows more than he's telling us." The sky was heavy with dark clouds as Elena and Sarah made their way to the docks, the wind biting at their faces. They had agreed to meet Tom there, hoping he could shed light on what was happening. The storm seemed to be getting closer with each passing hour, and the town had a feeling of quiet unease, as if everyone sensed that something was coming but no one dared to speak of it. When they arrived, Tom was already there, sitting on his usual bench, staring out at the sea. His expression was grim, his body tense, as if he were bracing for something he knew he couldn't stop. "You came," Tom said as they approached, his voice rough but steady. "We need to know the truth, Tom," Elena said, trying to keep her voice calm, though inside she felt a rising panic. "What's happening to this town? What's happening to Luke?" Tom was silent for a long time, his eyes never leaving the waves. Finally he spoke, his voice low and heavy. "This town has a history, Elena. A history most people don't like to talk about. 50 years ago, when that storm hit, it wasn't just the wind and the rain that took people. There was something else, something darker." Sarah shuddered beside Elena, her grip tightening on her coat. "What do you mean? What happened to the people who disappeared?" Tom shook his head, his face shadowed by old memories. "No one knows for sure. Some say they drowned, others think they just vanished into the storm. But there were always rumors that the sea took them, that something in the water claimed them." Elena felt her stomach twist. "And now it's happening again?" Tom nodded slowly. "It feels like it. The storm, it's the same. The way the air feels, the way the sea looks, and your paintings, Elena. They're stirring up things that have been buried for a long time." "I didn't mean to," Elena began, but Tom held up his hand. "I know you didn't mean to, but sometimes the past has a way of coming back when we least expect it." Sarah's voice broke through the tension, filled with desperation. "What about Luke? What does this have to do with him?" Tom sighed, his gaze finally shifting from the sea to Sarah. "I don't know, but I think your boy is connected to this somehow. Maybe the sea's reaching for him the way it did for those people all those years ago." "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. "I won't let that happen." Elena's mind raced. She thought about the boy in the painting, the way his eyes had darkened, the storm in the background growing more violent. It was as if her art was trying to tell her something she hadn't yet figured out. "What do we do?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom stood up, his face set with determination. "There's one place we haven't gone yet." "The lighthouse." "The lighthouse?" Sarah asked, confused. Tom nodded. "It's where it all started. The storm, the disappearances. That lighthouse has been standing for over 100 years, guiding ships through these waters. But after the storm 50 years ago, it went dark. No one's been there since. I think there's something up there, something we need to see." Elena hesitated. The lighthouse was perched on the cliffs overlooking the sea, a place of legend and fear among the locals. But if there were answers to be found, that's where they would be. "We have to go," Elena said, her voice firm. "We need to understand what's happening before it's too late." The walk to the lighthouse was treacherous. The wind had picked up and the sky was a swirling mass of black clouds, threatening to unleash the full force of the storm at any moment. The path along the cliffs was narrow and uneven, the waves crashing violently against the rocks below. Sarah walked beside Eleanor, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Do you really think we'll find answers up here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted, "but we can't just sit back and do nothing." Ahead of them, Tom moved steadily toward the lighthouse, his steps sure despite the gusts of wind trying to knock them off balance. As they neared the top of the cliff, the lighthouse loomed before them, tall, old, and weather-beaten. Its windows were cracked, and the light at the top was long since extinguished. Tom pushed open the rusted door with a heavy creak, and they stepped inside. The air was damp and cold, the sound of the storm muffled by the thick stone walls. Inside, the lighthouse was dark and empty, the spiral staircase leading up to the top barely visible in the dim light. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah whispered, clutching her coat tighter around her shoulders. Elena understood. There was something unsettling about the lighthouse, as if it were holding on to secrets it didn't want to share. The walls seemed to hum with old memories, and every step they took echoed eerily through the empty space. Tom led the way up the stairs, the sound of their footsteps bouncing off the stone walls. As they climbed higher, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something unseen, but very much present. When they reached the top, they found an old room filled with dust and cobwebs. A large window looked out over the sea, but the view was obscured by the thick clouds and rain. In the corner of the room, there was an old wooden desk covered in papers and maps, long forgotten by time. Tom walked over to the desk and began rifling through the papers. "This is it," he muttered. "This is where it all started." Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes scanning the yellowed maps and faded documents. There were old ship routes, weather reports, and notes written in a hurried, messy hand. But one piece of paper caught her attention, a sketch of the sea, drawn in careful detail. In the center of the drawing was a small boat, barely visible among the waves. And above the boat there was something else, something that looked like a figure, standing tall and dark against the sky. "What is this?" Elena whispered, picking up the paper. Tom glanced at it, his face grim. "That's what the old lighthouse keeper saw the night of the storm. He said he saw something in the water, something that wasn't human. No one believed him, but after that night he left town. Never came back." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "And you think that's what's coming for Luke?" "I don't know," Tom said quietly. "But I think we're about to find out." Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the windows of the lighthouse. The storm was almost here, and with it, whatever had been buried for the past 50 years. The wind howled against the walls of the lighthouse, as if the storm itself was trying to break inside. Elena stared at the sketch in her hands, the figure on the paper haunting her. There was something about it, something that made her feel like it was watching her, waiting. Sarah, her breath shaky, stepped closer to the window, peering out at the churning sea. "It's getting worse," she whispered. "The storm, it's coming faster than we thought." Tom, still looking over the old papers on the desk, shook his head. "It's not just the weather. There's something else driving this storm." Elena's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean? What else could it be?" Tom looked up, his face grim. "The sea doesn't forget, Elena. The people who disappeared during the last storm, they're still out there. They're part of this now." Sarah's eyes widened in fear. "You think they're coming back?" Tom didn't answer right away, but the look on his face told them everything they needed to know. Elena felt a wave of dread wash over her. She thought about her paintings, the way they had captured the storm and the people she had never met, the way they seemed to come from somewhere deep within the town's past. She had tried to ignore it, tried to explain it away as coincidence or inspiration, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at work. "We need to leave," Tom said suddenly, his voice firm. "This lighthouse, it's where the storm started, but it's not safe here. We need to get back to town before it gets worse." Eleanor and Sarah nodded, too afraid to argue. Together they hurried down the spiral staircase and out into the storm. The wind hit them like a wall, nearly knocking them off their feet as they stumbled down the narrow path along the cliffs. The sky was a swirling mass of black clouds, the sea crashing violently against the rocks below. As they made their way back to town, Elena felt something shift in the air. It wasn't just the storm. It was something else, something darker. She could feel it pressing in on them, like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching from the shadows. "We're almost there!" Tom shouted over the wind, leading them through the narrow streets toward the gallery. But as they neared the town square, they saw something that made them stop in their tracks. In the distance, near the docks, there was a figure standing in the storm. It was hard to see through the rain and darkness, but the figure was tall, unmoving, and completely out of place. Sarah gasped, clutching Elena's arm. "Who is that?" Tom squinted through the rain, his face pale. "That's not a person," he muttered. "It's something else." Elena's breath caught in her throat. The figure looked like the one she had seen in the sketch, the one drawn by the old lighthouse keeper all those years ago. It stood there, watching, as if waiting for something or someone. Suddenly, Sarah let out a strangled cry. "Luke!" Elena's heart dropped. She followed Sarah's gaze and saw Luke standing near the docks, his small figure barely visible in the storm. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and he was walking toward the figure as if in a trance. "No!" Sarah screamed, breaking into a run, but the wind was too strong and she stumbled, falling to her knees. Tom grabbed her arm, pulling her back up. "We have to get him before it's too late." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She ran toward the docks, the wind whipping at her clothes, the rain blinding her as she pushed forward. Luke was getting closer to the figure, and Elena could see now that it wasn't human. It was dark, shadowy, its form shifting in the wind like smoke, and it was calling to Luke, pulling him closer with every step. "Luke, stop!" Elena shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. But Luke didn't stop. He kept walking, his eyes fixed on the figure ahead of him. Elena felt panic rise in her chest. She had to reach him, had to stop him before it was too late. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed forward, her feet slipping on the wet ground as she closed the distance between them. Just as Luke was about to step off the dock and into the water, Elena grabbed his arm, pulling him back with all her strength. "Luke, no!" she cried, holding him tightly as he struggled against her grip. For a moment, Luke's eyes flickered, and he looked up at her, confused. "Elena?" "It's okay," she whispered, trying to catch her breath. "You're safe now." But as she looked up, her heart froze. The figure was still there, standing at the edge of the dock, watching them. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull everything around them into nothingness. "Elena," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. "It's calling me. I can hear them." Elena felt a chill run through her. "Who, Luke? Who's calling you?" "The people in the water," Luke said, his voice distant. "They want me to come with them." Eleanor's mind raced. The storm, the disappearances, the figure on the dock, it was all connected. But why Luke? Why was the sea calling to him? Tom and Sarah finally reached them, breathless and soaked from the rain. Sarah fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around Luke, holding him as if she would never let go. "Luke, baby, it's okay," Sarah sobbed, her voice shaking. "You're not going anywhere. You're staying with me." Tom stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the figure. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice low. "Now." Elena nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She helped Sarah to her feet, and together they began to retreat from the docks, keeping Luke close. But as they moved, the figure followed, its shadowy form gliding across the ground, almost floating in the wind. "It's not going to stop," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "It's coming for him." Tom's face was pale, his eyes filled with a fear Elena hadn't seen before. "We have to take him to the lighthouse," he said suddenly. "It's the only place where they won't follow." Elena frowned. "But why? What's so special about the lighthouse?" Tom didn't answer. He just grabbed Luke's hand and started walking, his face set with determination. "Trust me," he said. "It's the only way." They moved quickly through the storm, the figure still following them, its presence growing stronger with every step. Elena felt the air grow colder, the wind howling louder, as if the storm itself was alive, feeding off their fear. When they reached the lighthouse, Tom pushed open the door, and they hurried inside, slamming it shut behind them. The wind pounded against the walls, but inside it was eerily quiet, the sound of the storm muffled by the thick stone. Elena held Luke close, her heart racing. What now? Tom glanced out the window, his face tight with worry. "Now we wait." Inside the lighthouse, the air was thick with tension. The sound of the storm echoed around them, but the walls seemed to hold the worst of it at bay. "Elena," Sarah and Tom stood huddled around Luke, who sat on the cold floor, his eyes still distant, as though he were hearing something none of them could. Outside, the wind roared, shaking the old building. Eleanor could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on them, as if it were more than just wind and rain. It was something alive, something furious. "What now, Tom?" Sarah asked, her voice barely steady. "What's happening out there?" Tom paced the small space, his face pale but determined. "This lighthouse, it's more than just a building. It's where everything started. It's a barrier between us and them." "Who are them?" Eleanor asked, fear tightening in her chest. Tom stopped, turning to look at her, his eyes dark. "The ones who disappeared in the storm 50 years ago, the ones who didn't drown, they were taken." "Taken by what?" Sarah whispered, clutching Luke's hand tightly. "The sea," Tom said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "Or something in the sea. It claims those it wants, and once it has them, it never lets go." Elena felt her skin crawl. But why Luke? Why is it calling to him? Tom shook his head. "I don't know. But I think Luke's connected to this place, just like those people were. And now the sea is calling him too." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Number, I won't let it take him." Elena knelt down beside Luke, her heart pounding in her chest. "Luke," she said softly, "can you hear me? You don't have to listen to them. You don't belong to them." Luke's eyes flickered, as if he were trying to focus, but the faraway look didn't leave his face. "They're here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're waiting for me." Outside, the wind howled louder, and through the cracked windows, Elena could see shadows moving in the storm, figures dark and shifting, like the one they had seen at the docks. There were more of them now, circling the lighthouse, waiting. "They're not going to stop," Tom muttered, his voice filled with dread. "They're going to keep coming." Eleanor felt her panic rising, but she fought to keep calm. She looked at Tom, her voice steady despite the fear. "You said the lighthouse is a barrier, but why? Why is this place different?" Tom hesitated. "Because it's where the last lighthouse keeper tried to stop them. He knew something was coming, something from the sea. He tried to warn the town, but no one believed him. On the night of the storm, he turned the light on, trying to guide the ships to safety, but—" "But what?" Eleanor pressed. "He vanished. Some say he was taken, just like the others. But the light stayed on, even after he disappeared. That's why they couldn't get through." Elena's mind raced. "So we need to turn the light back on?" Tom nodded slowly. "It's the only thing that can keep them at bay." Without wasting another moment, Elena jumped to her feet and ran toward the stairs, leading up to the top of the lighthouse. The others followed close behind, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The storm raged outside, the walls of the lighthouse trembling with every gust of wind. When they reached the top, they found the old light, rusted and unused for years. Elena's heart sank. It was massive, and there was no telling if it even still worked. "Do you know how to turn it on?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. Tom stepped forward, examining the light. "I think so. It's old, but if we can get it running, it might still work." Elena watched as Tom began working, her heart racing. The wind was louder now, and through the windows she could see the figures getting closer, their shadowy forms swirling in the storm. The air was thick with a strange energy, and Eleanor could feel the pull of the sea growing stronger. "Hurry!" she urged, her voice trembling. Tom grunted in frustration as he worked, twisting old knobs and pulling levers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lighthouse flickered to life. The huge light buzzed and sputtered, but then, with a loud click, it came on, casting a bright beam out over the dark sea. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The wind died down, the figures outside hesitated, and the storm seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor held her breath, hoping, praying that this was enough, but then Luke spoke, his voice soft and distant. They're still here. Eleanor's heart sank. She turned to Luke, who was standing by the window, staring out at the sea. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "They want me to go with them," he whispered. "I have to go." "No!" Sarah cried, rushing to her son's side. "You're not going anywhere. You're staying here with me." Luke looked at her, tears welling up in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mum. I can't stop them." Eleanor felt the weight of his words sink in. The light had stopped the figures from coming any closer, but it hadn't broken the connection between Luke and whatever was out there in the storm. "There has to be another way," Elena whispered, her mind racing. "We can't let them take him." Tom looked at her, his face grim. "There's only one thing left to do." Elena frowned. "What?" Tom hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone has to go out there. Someone has to break the connection." Elena's stomach dropped. "You mean—" Tom nodded. "They're here for Luke. But if we can draw them away, we might be able to stop this." Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She looked at Luke, who was staring out at the storm, his small body trembling with fear. She couldn't let them take him. She couldn't let him go. "I'll go," Elena said, her voice steady. Sarah gasped. "No, you can't." But Elena had already made up her mind. She wasn't from this town. She wasn't part of its past. But she had been drawn here for a reason. She had a part to play. Tom nodded, his face filled with sorrow. "Be careful." Elena took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she stepped toward the door. The wind hit her like a wall as she stepped outside, the cold cutting through her like ice. The figures in the storm turned toward her, their dark forms shifting in the wind. "I'm here," Eleanor called, her voice strong despite the fear coursing through her. "You don't need Luke. I'm here." For a moment, the figures hesitated. Then, slowly, they began to move toward her, leaving the lighthouse behind. Elena took a step forward, the wind pushing against her, threatening to knock her off her feet. She could feel the pull of the sea, the cold, dark water calling to her, but she kept moving, step by step, toward the edge of the cliff. The figures followed, their presence growing stronger, their whispers filling her ears. She could feel them now, feel their cold hands reaching for her, pulling her closer to the sea. But Elena didn't stop. She walked until she stood at the very edge of the cliff, the waves crashing below her, the wind howling in her ears. And then, just as the figures reached her, she stepped forward into the abyss. For a moment everything went silent. The wind stopped, the storm quieted, and the figures disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Back at the lighthouse, Sarah cried out in grief, her sobs filling the empty space. Tom stood silently beside her, his face pale with sorrow. But Luke was still there. The connection was broken. If this story touched you, remember, there's always more to uncover. Subscribe, like, and share to join us on the journey of uncovering hidden truths together.